Hello, everyone. Welcome to the distribution demo for April 29th, 2021. Today, I'm going to be talking about the story I've been working on about automatically validating Letsencrypt integration for Omnibus. And so this is a story that I'm looking here on my web browser on the left. This is an issue that I got open because um, our Acme client that we use in our cookbooks for doing Letsencrypt stuff got updated. And since we only had specs that chef specs to validate behavior, we ended up pushing a broken change to production and finding out later. So, I mean, so that's the impetus behind this issue. A little bit more about the current state of things before this MR. So like I said, we do have a Let's Encrypt spec. I'm looking at it here on the right, which is good, but specs are really only helpful for chef when you're trying to understand how attributes are going to be modifying the behavior of your recipes. If you're doing if else, or filtering, including recipes depending on whether a node is Red Hat or Ubuntu, stuff like that. So the specs aren't really meant to catch this sort of issue anyway, but we do have some, so that's good. Building on that though, so the way that the Let's Encrypt works in the Omnibus right now, I'll cover very briefly for those not familiar. Let me know if I get anything wrong here. But basically, we have this Let's Encrypt cookbook. I'm looking at the enable recipe in it right now on the right side of my screen. And so you can see here on line 44, well, first of all, it generates a self-signed certificate. So Nginx will be working and serving on port 443. But then it goes ahead and includes this recipe, and it's including it based off an attribute. I believe we only support HTTP 101 right now in Omnibus because there is not, you can see, include Let's Encrypt attribute authorization. And then if we look in the folder, the only one there is HTTP. So that means, a service has to open their port 80 to do the validation instead of DNS. So there might be a future enhancement here to enable DNS Let's Encrypt.
We've got a nice issue for that one. It all comes down to now you have a random node somewhere touching your DNS. So we have to be very careful about that. I'll admit, I didn't actually realize we just made it self-signed. So we do have that functionality.
It's kind of interesting how this flow works in Omnibus because, like, first off, we generate the self-sign, and then we go into the HTTP authorization and call this Let's Encrypt certificate resource. And so if you look in resources certificate, that's what this is calling. And so this requests Let's Encrypt certificate from the staging endpoint to make sure it works. And there's a comment here. We're kind of just helping customers not get themselves into trouble with the rate limits, because if you set up your domains and you set up your configuration and you run this and it doesn't work, you only hit the staging endpoint. You didn't hit the Let's Encrypt production endpoint, which is going to start rate limiting you. So I guess while customer or users of this are figuring this out, this block is here to help them not get into a situation where they have to wait another day to try to deploy GitLab. And so it generates the staging certificate. It resets the private key for Acme, which is required to do this again, and then it requests the production certificate, which is then used. So that's the flow of it. When I was first looking into this issue, we had hard-coded, there were a couple of things that made this difficult. So for one, this dir argument is actually the argument for the Acme endpoint that you want to hit. And I say Acme endpoint instead of Let's Encrypt endpoint because Letsencrypt is just an implementation of the Acme protocol. And there are actually, I don't know how many, but it seems like more every month, services that allow you to get Acme certificates that are not Letsencrypt. So I removed the hard-coded values here and moved them into attributes that default to Let's Encrypt endpoints. But this is not the point of this MR, but this will allow our users to also use those other Acme endpoints if they want to for whatever reasons. Does that make sense so far?
Sounds like you're knocking out a couple of feature requests here.
Yep. Well, I mean, it's good for testing and it's good for users, so I think that's pretty good. Okay, so now we have the endpoints parameterized here. They default to Let's Encrypt, as I said, but for testing, we don't want to use the production Let's Encrypt endpoint, of course, because of rate limiting. But using the staging Let's Encrypt endpoint for testing is actually not so great either, because it also has rate limits. They're higher than production, but so there's a couple of things going on here. Like there's the rate limits, and this failed validations limit 64 hours. Probably the one that would hit most people because the other limits are pretty high. But you also, and I'll get into this more when I talked about like using Pebble and our own Acme endpoint for testing, that you can't test. It will identify you as malicious if you are trying to do tests with the control flow of Let's Encrypt. So if you're like submitting invalid nonces to the endpoint, it's going to notice that after a little while and block your IP. So staging isn't really a solution here either. So what is the solution? Well, this was something that Mitch actually brought up. I had not been aware of it, but Let's Encrypt has this project called Pebble. It's all up on GitHub. And basically this lets you run an Acme server in a Docker container, which is great for us because we test GitLab Omnibus in a Docker container as well for like QA tests and stuff. So linking those two containers, it removes the rate limit problem, and then it also opens up a lot of possibilities for us to do testing based on control flows, which I'll get into in a couple minutes here. Okay, so we've got Pebble, and then we've got this other tool called Chow Test Serve, which is not the most inspired name, but it's a challenge test server. And so I'm going to open up the Docker Compose here. Well, I guess I already have it open. So we've got 3 images here. This is the testing Docker Compose. And so for the first image, this is the GitLab EE image. And then we've got Pebble, which is configured, and then child test server. And so the child test server allows you to not only mock DNS, but mock challenges to the Acme endpoint. I'll make this a little bigger. And so these are all working together because you see here to Pebble, we're passing the DNS server argument, which is the child test server. So Pebble is talking to that for its DNS. And so when we're running tests, we've got this function here called start Pebble, which starts Pebble in the challenge test server. And then once those are up, it posts to the challenge test server this mock A record. So we're saying gitlab.example.com, which is what our host name is for the GitLab image, should point to that IP address. And so this is how there's not, as far as I can tell, there's not a config file for this shell test serve. you just make API requests to it to set it up in a state. It can do a lot more than we're using it for here. I don't like with a lot of this, like infrastructure and tools, the Pebble, Child Tester, Boulder, a lot of it was built by Letsencrypt to test their own services. And so we're just kind of using smaller parts of it. There's this other tool they have called Boulder, which is bigger than Pebble. That it's basically like a whole application. Like you need to stand up several services that all talk to each other. And I suppose if you were trying to develop your own Acme client or something, that might be the way you'd go. But for our test purposes, does this work as expected? Pebble is more than enough. Okay, so I'm going to run this in the background while I talk about it a little bit more in the test. So one issue that I ran into that was interesting is that I wanted a way in the test to run the GitLab Omnibus Docker image, and then when it was done configuring, just stop. Like I didn't want it to keep running. And so looking into how we do this a little more, if you look into this wrapper, which is the entry point for the GitLab Omnibus Docker image, scroll all the way to the bottom. There's this GitLab post configure script, which evals anything you pass to it. And so in the test, we're setting that value to exit. And so when it starts up, it configures GitLab. It gets here, it just runs exit. So it's not tailing the logs or waiting for it. So I was glad to see that we had this hook in there. Otherwise, we would have to like update the entry point and add some more stuff to it. Okay. So I've got the image here since this is still at MR. It's got my MR tag. This is just because I added those attributes for the cookbook and they're only on my branch right now. We've got cleanup, which we always do, and then the post configure. And so by default, when you run this, it just runs all the way through. It either passes or fails. That means you either got your Letsencrypt certificates or you didn't. But for development, we can be a little friendlier. And so if I set this GitLab post configure script just to an empty string and then say don't clean up, it'll keep GitLab up so we can inspect it and make sure everything's working as we expected. And on the left side here, I'm going to log Pebble and the challenge test server so we can see those calls going. Okay, any particular part of this that anybody has questions, comments on right now?
I saw it supports IPv6, not us, but the Acme stuff.
Yeah, yep. Yeah, by default, we have, so there's a couple files here. There's this Pebble config file. And so I changed, like by default, Pebble runs its challenges against the port 5000, 5002 instead of a lower valued port because it's made for our Docker images that are running with higher port numbers so they don't have to run as privileged. But for us, GitLab runs as 80 and 443, so it's already, it's running as root in the container, so it's not really a concern. But so I changed this to 80, and then in the child test serve, I also set the port to 80. And so yeah, if you can kind of, the only thing we have turned on for this test is HTTP/01, but yeah, if you wanted to do other test IP6, you could just add that as a flag.
Cool.
Yeah, I don't know if that's something that we've seen or I don't know how many customers are running Git or users are running GitLab with IP6. That would be interesting to know.
Yeah, I'm not sure we do know that. I would suspect a small number.
Right. Yeah. So the only other file here is this Pebble minica.pem, which is basically we have to mount it into the GitLab container so that when we make our HTTPS request to Pebble, Pebble doesn't do HTTP. It's got to be TLS. And so this makes it so it's trusted. So you can see here on the left that Pebble, we made our order. This is during the whole Letsencrypt flow. And then you can see here, issued certificate serial for order, blah, blah, blah. So that means this succeeded. In general, the logs for Pebble are really good. Like I went through several iterations of all of the config here, and it told me what was wrong in a clear way every time. So that was nice. On the right here, the only thing that the challenge test server is, it's just saying we added that stub, which is when I made that post. That's the log for that. Okay, looks like we're getting close to the end of our run. We're authorizing Grafana. While I'm waiting for this to finish up, I can talk about this MR that has all of this is currently in draft, but the last thing to figure out is really just running this NCI. And so I have added this trigger Letsencrypt test right next to the QA because it needs the GitLab Docker image to be built, and then you pass it to that. So I'm just working on some issues right there with like passing the image name and stuff correctly. But once we get that set, then the plan is to get this merged together, and then not like well, I mean, the ultimate plan is to get it running with GitLab QA instead. And we've already got some good examples for how to do this. Like for testing against Mattermost, we spin up a separate container, I think. And so this would be somewhat similar to that. And that way we could have it running as part of the GitLab QA suite instead of just kind of a one-off functional test. Okay, it looks like GitLab is running now. And so if I go to HTTPS localhost 8443, of course, this is not CA signed, but let me just set a password quick. Password. Okay, well, you can see it all works fine there. And then if we go through and inspect the certificate here, view certificate, you can see it is issued by Pebble Intermediate CA, the alt name gitlabexample.com. By default, these are issued for 5 years, which is, I think, kind of an interesting choice for a test server, but I'm sure that's configurable if you care. Okay. Questions, comments, concerns? That's really most of it here.
So you were showing us how you were running it locally. Was there anything different to how you were trying to run it in CI yet?
Well, for CI, I'm running it the same way. I'm cding into the folder and just running that test.shell. The part that's unclear right now is how I get these image and tag variables, just because it seems like QA gets them without having to know. Like maybe there's some logic in there getting the variables the right way, but yeah, I feel like once we get these references figured out, it'll just work.
One thing to consider, and I don't know if this will be a good idea or not, but instead of using Docker Compose, we could try just using the built-in GitLab runner services. So like this in your CI, and I don't think we've done this before, but we'd have a job where the main image is our GitLab Docker image that we want to test, and then the two service images would be, one would be Pebble and one would be this the certificate handler.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And you might get away without Docker Compose, perhaps. I don't know. We definitely haven't done before, like execing into the omnibus image, other like using a script rather than the wrapper. So it would be like the job itself would be the exec script, and you would probably run the wrapper, but then also run your test in that exec script type thing.
Okay. Yeah, I get what you're saying. I mean, that would cut down. Yeah. I mean, I kind of thought about
it's more. I'm not sure if it's super helpful for this. It's more like I don't know if that's a step closer to what we'd end up doing in QA or not. I'm not sure.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, we could. When I was working up this test script, I thought about, we could just run all of this in Docker as well to get rid of that Docker Compose dependency. But then I started to trial out doing that and having this all in one place and readable versus a bunch of Docker args. Like, yeah, I think using GitLab services would be an improvement, but I think going from Docker Compose back to Docker like makes this a lot harder to read. Okay. Anybody else? All right, fair enough. Well, yeah, I'm hoping to get this, once we get this image out, we'll be putting it up for review, and then once we get this sorted, then we'll be moving on to integrating into QA. And I think that will be the point where we might want to look into doing it with services. I'm not sure how that's going to look right now, because I'm still learning about how QA works. But I guess one question I have is, are we doing this for the charts? Like, are we validating Letsencrypt this way with the charts?
We are not.
Okay. Should we?
Maybe we
Yeah.
should probably set up we should probably set up a Let's Encrypt test. We don't have to. Yeah, it would probably be very similar, just swapping out the like booting up Pebble and swapping out the staging directory, or I guess it wouldn't be staging, it would be, in the case of our charts, we only set one.
Yeah. Well, I could see that, being a benefit of moving it into QA is that instead of doing it one way in Omnibus and one way in the charts, perhaps we could get it set up in QA that it will run against both and validate the same behavior. One thing I noticed while working on this is, I don't know if it's a big deal for us, but so I mentioned the workflow stuff briefly before, as far as the Acme workflow with the requests back and forth and the nonces and authorization. So I had to turn, so by default, Pebble turns a few things on, like to test the workflow more specifically. And they're not saying that all of the Acme clients out there are implement this right now, but they're saying they should. And I had to turn some of these off for the Acme client gem that we're using in our cookbooks. And so this just includes things like making sure you can't do replay attacks against your Acme server if you get your hands on a challenged nonce. Or sometimes it will like sleep for a random amount of seconds between 0 and 15 before it gives you an answer, and then the client is supposed to be able to handle that and do retries and all that. And so when I first was going at this, I just had everything on the defaults, and it didn't work because I had to turn off that sleeping, and then I had to turn off this replay nonce. So I'll probably open another issue to do a little investigation into this, but yeah, ideally we wouldn't have to be turning these flags off because they are meant to protect the Acme endpoint. Okay, well, it looks like we're almost at time here. Thanks for watching the demo. If you have any other questions, feel free to hit me up after.
Thanks, Dustin.
Yep, thank you. See ya.